He was 18 years old, standing on a gravel driveway with a garbage bag full of clothes and $43 in his pocket. Victor Brennan had just changed the locks. His mother hadn't said a word. The neighbors watched from behind curtain edges along Oakmont Drive in Ashford, Virginia. Nobody stopped it. Nobody helped. That was the day Marcus Rivers should have broken, the day the world fully expected him to fail. Instead, he drove 30 miles into the Blue Ridge foothills, paid $5 for a rotting log cabin nobody wanted, and began building something so extraordinary that the people who threw him out would one day beg to be let back in. The morning started like most mornings in the Brennan household, with tension so thick you could cut it with a hunting knife. Marcus had lived in that house for 6 years, ever since his mother Elena had married Victor in a small courthouse ceremony Marcus hadn't been invited to attend. He'd been 12 then, eating a peanut butter sandwich at school, while his mother signed papers that would reshape both their lives. Thomas Rivers, his biological father, had left when Marcus was 6, without so much as a forwarding address, and Elena had spent the years since then hollowed out by loneliness and the particular terror of being abandoned again. Victor wasn't cruel in the dramatic movie villain sense. He was something more insidious than that. He was indifferent. To Victor, Marcus was a footnote, an inconvenience that had come packaged with the woman he loved. He never hit the boy. He never screamed at him. He simply looked through him the way you look through a window at something more interesting on the other side. Elena had the kind of beauty that photographs well but fades fast under stress, and stress had been her constant companion. She loved her son. Nobody who knew her would dispute that. But she loved her marriage more, or maybe she was just terrified of being alone again. When you've been abandoned once, the fear of it happening again can make you do things you'll spend the rest of your life trying to forgive yourself for. The fight that final morning was about something absurd in retrospect: a college acceptance letter. Marcus had applied quietly and secretly to 3 schools using the public library computer and listing Tyler Chen's address on all the paperwork. Tyler was his best friend since 7th grade, a lanky kid from a Korean-American family who lived 3 blocks away. Tyler's mother, Lisa, made the best kimchi jjigae in Henderson County and treated Marcus like a second son every time he came through her kitchen door. It was Lisa who had quietly handed Marcus the acceptance letter from Asheville Community College one Tuesday afternoon, pressing it into his hands with both of hers, her eyes shining. The words tumbled out warm and certain. "You're going to do something wonderful, Marcus. I just know it." He'd believed her for exactly 4 days, which was how long it took Victor to find the letter. Nobody ever knew exactly how. What mattered was that on the morning of October 14th, Victor came downstairs holding that letter between 2 fingers, like it was something diseased, and he set it on the breakfast table in front of Marcus without a word. Then the silence exploded. Victor wasn't angry about the acceptance. He was angry about the secret, angry that Marcus had used Tyler's address, like "you're ashamed of this house," angry about the financial aid application, which Victor irrationally and incorrectly believed would somehow trigger an audit. He was angry in the way small men get angry when they sense that someone younger and more capable is beginning to outgrow them. Oh. The words came out controlled and quiet, which was somehow worse than shouting, "You don't appreciate a single thing. 6 years under my roof. 6 years of groceries, utilities, a bed to sleep in." Elena's voice was barely a whisper. "Victor?" His hand went up, cutting her off. "No. He wants to go to college. He can figure out how to do that on his own. He's 18. He's an adult. I want him out by noon." The words sat in the kitchen like smoke. Marcus looked at his mother. Elena looked at her coffee cup. In the 6 seconds that followed, she made the worst decision of her life, and she made it in silence. She said nothing. She turned the cup in her hands, and in that gesture, Marcus understood everything he needed to understand about what his place in that house had always been. He didn't cry. He didn't yell. He went upstairs, packed what he could fit in 2 garbage bags, came back down and walked out the front door. Victor was already in the living room watching television. Elena came to the doorway, just the doorway, not outside, and the words caught in her throat. "Marcus, honey, just give him a few days to calm down." His response was simple, and the terrible thing was that it actually was okay, in the way that a bone-breaking clean is somehow less complicated than one that splinters. "It's okay, Mom. Clean breaks at least can heal straight." He walked down the driveway. He didn't look back. He had his garbage bags, his worn-out Carhartt jacket, $43 in his wallet, and a 2001 Ford Ranger he'd bought himself with 16 months of weekend wages from Jack Patterson's hardware store on Route 64. The truck burned oil, and the heater only worked if you hit the dashboard in exactly the right spot. But it was his, and right now his was a very short list. He drove to Tyler's house first. Lisa opened the door before he even knocked. Must have seen the truck from the window, and she pulled him inside and sat him at the kitchen table and put food in front of him without asking a single question. Tyler came downstairs, took one look at the garbage bags in the hallway, and sat down across from his friend. The question came out practical, direct. "How long do you need to stay?" Marcus shook his head. "I'm not staying, but thank you, both of you." Lisa started to protest. Marcus held up his hand. "I need to figure something out on my own. If I stay here, I'll just be waiting for someone else to solve it." Tyler drove with him that afternoon to the county courthouse, where Marcus spent 2 hours researching something he'd heard about in passing from Jack Patterson, a county land auction for tax-delinquent properties. Jack had mentioned it once offhandedly, the way old men mention things they assume young people aren't really listening to. But Marcus had been listening. He was always listening. The next auction was in 3 days. He slept in the truck that night, parked in the lot behind the Hardys on Main Street, with a sleeping bag borrowed from Tyler and the heater hitting the dashboard every 20 minutes when the cab got too cold. He ate a gas station sandwich for dinner and a bruised apple for breakfast, and spent the hours in between making a list on the back of a receipt. The list had one item: don't quit. The Henderson County tax auction was held on a Thursday morning in a fluorescent-lit room at the county administration building that smelled like old carpet and burnt coffee. There were maybe 30 people in folding chairs, mostly older men in work coats, a few sharp-suited real estate investors tapping at phones, a woman from a local property company whom everyone seemed to know by name. Marcus sat in the back row in his Carhartt jacket with $43 in his wallet, and the very real possibility that none of this was going to work. The properties came up one by one. Most of them were vacant lots or condemned structures that got snapped up by the investors within seconds, the bidding moving so fast Marcus could barely follow it. He watched the woman from the property company win 4 parcels in a row without breaking a sweat. He watched his chances narrow with every gavel strike. Then the auctioneer, a heavy-set man named Dale Pittman, who had the bored deficiency of someone who'd done this job for 20 years too long, read out the next listing: Parcel 44A, 47 acres. Ridgeview Mountain Trail, Blue Ridge Foothills. Timberland Rough Access Road, derelict structure on property. Taxes owed $312. Minimum opening bid $5. A ripple of laughter moved through the room. Someone in the front row muttered loud enough to carry, "What's on it, an outhouse?" Nobody raised a paddle. Marcus's hand went up. $5. Dale Pittman looked up from his papers and squinted at the back of the room. His voice carried a note of disbelief. $5. Do I hear 10? Silence. Going once, going twice. The gavel fell. Sold to the young man in the back for $5. The room moved on. Marcus sat very still, holding the number paddle in both hands, understanding that something enormous had just happened, though he couldn't yet see the shape of it. He paid his $5 at the cashier's window, plus $280 in back taxes that very nearly cleaned out everything he'd scraped together from Jack's hardware store wages, leaving him with $11 and some change. He drove out to Ridgeview Mountain Trail that same afternoon. The access road was barely a road, more of a suggestion left behind by someone's tire tracks years earlier. 2 shallow ruts through red clay and scrub growth. The truck bounced and scraped for nearly a mile before the trees opened up and he saw it. The cabin was not merely old, it was exhausted. It looked like a structure that had given up and was simply waiting for someone to come along and make it official. One corner of the roof had collapsed inward, leaving a gaping wound of exposed beams and rotted shingles. The porch had separated from the front wall and tilted at a drunken angle into the weeds. 2 of the 4 windows were completely gone, the openings covered by what had once been plywood, but was now something closer to wet cardboard. The logs themselves, actual hewn logs, hand-cut from the look of them, maybe a century old, had gone dark with moisture and were in some places fuzzy with moss. But the logs were still there, and they were enormous. Old-growth timber, the kind they stopped cutting decades ago because there wasn't any left. Marcus walked the perimeter, knocking on logs with his knuckle, pressing his thumb against the wood in different places, doing the things he'd watched Jack Patterson's crew do when examining lumber at the hardware store. Maybe 30% was truly compromised, soft and punky, where water had gotten in and stayed. The rest was solid, dense hardwood that had stood for 100 years and would stand for 100 more if someone cared enough to help it. He stood in front of the cabin as the October sun dropped behind the ridge and turned the sky the color of a fireplace, and he made a decision that he would later describe in interviews as either the bravest or the most naive thing he'd ever done. And the answer, he'd say, depended entirely on which year you asked him. He decided this was home. He slept in the truck again that night, but this time the truck was parked on his own land, and that made all the difference. What followed was not a montage. It was not a highlight reel. It was 9 months of cold injury, setback, humiliation, and the kind of grinding daily labor that has no audience and no applause, and requires a person to find their motivation from somewhere deep inside themselves in a place that doesn't care about being watched. Marcus's first problem was practical. He had no money and no power tools. His second problem was nearly as pressing. He had no knowledge. He'd grown up in suburban houses where maintenance meant calling a handyman. He had watched Jack Patterson's crew at the hardware store work on projects, absorbed things by proximity, the way you absorb language in a foreign country, but actually doing it, that was different. His education came from 3 sources. The first was Henry Morrison. Henry was 67 years old and lived in a farmhouse 4 miles down the mountain. Marcus found him entirely by accident when he drove down the road one afternoon, looking for anyone who might tell him something about the property's history. Henry was in his driveway, splitting firewood with the methodical efficiency of a man who has done something 10,000 times and no longer needs to think about it. He had the kind of face that has been outside in all weathers for 6 decades, creased, watchful, the color of old saddle leather. Marcus stopped the truck. He introduced himself. He explained what he'd bought. Henry set down his maul and looked at him for a long time, and when he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of someone who'd seen a lot of young people with a lot of ideas, the old Harker cabin. Marcus nodded. Another long moment passed. Then Henry gestured toward the house. "Come on in. My wife will make coffee." Henry's wife, Sarah, was a small, precise woman who moved through her kitchen with the confidence of someone who has run a household through hard times and knows there is nothing under her roof that cannot be fixed, made, or done without. She poured coffee and sliced pound cake and listened without comment while Marcus explained his situation with a directness that he'd learned was the only currency that actually worked with people like Henry and Sarah Morrison. He'd been thrown out. He had 47 acres and a ruin of a cabin. He had no money, limited skills, and nowhere else to go. Henry and Sarah exchanged the kind of married couple glance that contains entire conversations. Henry's question came out simple, testing. "You got tools? A hammer and a tape measure. Can you work from 5 in the morning until dark without complaining?" "Yes, sir." Henry nodded slowly, considering. "Come back Saturday. We'll start with the roof." What Henry gave Marcus over the next several months was not charity. It was mentorship of the old-fashioned kind, where the teacher is strict and demanding and doesn't praise you for the ordinary because the ordinary is expected. Henry had built 2 structures on his own property by hand. He'd learned from his father, who'd learned from his grandfather, and the knowledge had been passed down. The way knowledge gets passed down in families that can't afford to outsource their problems through demonstration, repetition, and the occasional sharp word when you weren't paying attention. The first Saturday, Henry arrived at the cabin at dawn, with a truck bed full of tools and a thermos of coffee so strong it could strip paint. They spent the morning surveying the damage, Henry pointing out load-bearing structures versus decorative elements, showing Marcus how to assess rot by the give of the wood under pressure, teaching him to read the grain for weakness. By noon, Marcus's notebook was full of sketches and measurements and instructions written in his own hand, because Henry believed that if you wrote something down, you'd remember it twice, as long as if you just heard it. That afternoon they began the dangerous work of removing the collapsed section of roof. Henry moved with deliberate care, explaining each step before taking it, showing Marcus where to stand, where not to stand, how to recognize when a beam was about to give. When a rafter snapped unexpectedly and swung within inches of Marcus's head, Henry didn't yell. He just waited until Marcus's breathing steadied, and then said quietly, "Now you know why I told you to keep your weight on the joists." The second source of education was the Henderson County Library, and a librarian named Margaret Foster, who had worked there for 31 years, and had over those 3 decades developed an uncanny ability to match the right book to the right person. When Marcus came in and explained somewhat awkwardly that he needed to learn construction and carpentry and possibly plumbing and electrical systems, Margaret didn't blink. She disappeared into the stacks and came back with 7 books that looked impossible and told him to start with the one on top. He read by flashlight in the truck for the first 2 months until he got the cabin weathertight enough to sleep in. The books became his nighttime companions: Basic Carpentry, Timber Framing Manual, Residential Plumbing, Electrical Wiring, Simplified. He read each one twice, taking notes in the margins, dog-earing pages he'd need to reference again. The third source of education was failure itself, which turned out to be the most thorough teacher of all. He collapsed a section of flooring he'd replaced incorrectly and put his leg through it to the knee, the impact jarring his hip and leaving a bruise the size of a dinner plate. He misread a weight calculation and had a section of replacement roofing material slide off the ridge and very nearly take his shoulder with it, missing him by less than a foot, and teaching him a lesson about gravity and angles that no book could have conveyed as effectively. He mixed concrete wrong 3 times before Henry, with the patience of a man who has watched young people make mistakes. His entire life showed him the correct consistency by squeezing it in his fist and holding it out. "There, you feel that? Remember that." He was cold constantly. The cabin, even as he repaired it section by section, was drafty and damp and smelled of decades of disuse. He cooked on a camp stove. He bathed in a creek that in January became an exercise in pure willpower, the kind of cold that made your lungs seize and your skin go numb within seconds. He drove to Tyler's house every 10 days or so to do laundry and call in a check from the hours he was still logging at Jack Patterson's store on weekends, because without those paychecks, small as they were, there was nothing. Jack Patterson himself became an unlikely ally. He was a compact, no-nonsense man in his late 50s who had run his hardware store for 25 years and had a policy of not getting involved in his employees' personal lives. But when he understood what Marcus was attempting, pieced it together from overheard conversations, and the specific nature of the materials Marcus asked about, Jack started doing something he'd never done before. He'd pull Marcus aside at the end of a shift and gesture toward a box in the corner. "I got a return on these timber screws. Nobody wants them. You might as well take them." Or, "Supplier sent extra caulking by mistake. Going in the dumpster otherwise." It wasn't charity. Jack was too proud for that, and he sensed Marcus was too. It was the kind of sideways generosity that lets both parties maintain their dignity. Over the course of that first year, the value of those returns and mistakes and going in the dumpster otherwise materials probably added up to $1,200, and it made the difference between possible and impossible. By February, Marcus had a solid roof, patched floors, and 2 working windows that he'd bought used from a demolition site for $60 each. By April, he had running water from a well he'd cleared and primed with Henry's guidance using reclaimed PVC pipes, and a hand pump that required 20 minutes of effort to fill a 5-gallon bucket, but felt like a miracle every single time. By June, he had electricity basic and limited run from a second-hand generator he'd found on Craigslist for $240, and a kitchen that functioned in the essential sense of the word counter from reclaimed barnwood sink from a salvage yard. No refrigerator, but a good cooler that he restocked with ice twice a week. The cabin was not beautiful yet, but it was alive. And then something happened that Marcus had not planned for, had not foreseen, and that would change the direction of everything. It was Tyler who took the picture. He'd driven up the mountain on a Saturday in late June, ostensibly to help Marcus clear brush from the south side of the property, but Tyler had also brought his camera, a mirrorless digital he'd bought secondhand and was teaching himself to use. Somewhere around mid-afternoon, with the light coming through the trees at that angle that only happens for about 40 minutes. In the late afternoon of a clear summer day, Tyler looked up from his work and saw Marcus standing on the repaired porch of the cabin with a coffee mug in his hand, looking out over the ridge, completely unaware of being watched. Behind Marcus, the cabin stood in golden light. The old logs were warm and dark, where they'd weathered, the new timber of the porch trim still bright where Marcus had replaced it. The whole structure somehow both ancient and newly alive. Around it, the mountain fell away in waves of green. The sky behind the ridge was burning orange. Tyler took the photo. The composition was instinctive. Marcus slightly off-center, following the rule of thirds, backlit, so there was a rim of light on his hair and shoulders, the warm glow on the logs creating depth and contrast. He posted it to Instagram that evening with a simple caption, "My friend Marcus bought an abandoned cabin for $5 when he was 18. 8 months later, this is what he's built all by himself, almost no money." By the next morning, it had 40,000 likes. By the following Monday, it had been picked up by 3 regional news outlets, a homesteading Facebook group with 2 million members, and a website called Blue Ridge Revival that covered sustainable living and off-grid projects across Appalachia. Marcus didn't have reliable internet access. He found out what had happened when he drove down to Tyler's house that Tuesday and walked into the kind of barely contained chaos he was completely unprepared for. Tyler's phone was ringing constantly. His inbox was full. There were interview requests from news stations in Asheville, Charlotte, and Raleigh. A production company in Nashville had emailed inquiring about potential documentary or television content. A man named Stephen Gardner, who turned out to be a fairly well-known YouTube personality in the homesteading and self-sufficiency space with 1.2 million subscribers, had personally messaged Tyler asking for an introduction. Marcus sat down at Tyler's kitchen table and stared at the screen for a long time. The numbers kept climbing. Comments poured in from people he'd never met, would never meet, telling him his story had inspired them, made them cry, made them want to build something with their own hands. Tyler's question was careful, leaving room. "What do you want to do?" Marcus thought about it. He thought about all the ways sudden attention could go wrong, how it could twist something pure into something performative. He thought about being 18 months ago, eating a gas station sandwich in a dark parking lot, making a list with one item on it. He thought about what this property could become if he had resources, if he could share what he was learning, if he could help other people find what he'd found in the work of making something real. The words came out certain, "I want to start a YouTube channel." Tyler grinned so wide it looked like it hurt. They called the channel River's Edge. Tyler became the camera operator and editor. Marcus became the on-camera presence. Though presence was a kind way to describe his early appearances. He was awkward, soft-spoken, unsure where to look clearly, more comfortable working with his hands than talking to a lens. But there was something about his authenticity that connected with people in a way no amount of polish could manufacture. He was genuinely doing this. Every repair was real. Every mistake was real. Every moment of quiet satisfaction when something worked, that was real too. The first episode was titled, "Why I Bought This Cabin for $5." And it was 18 minutes of Marcus walking through the property explaining his situation with the same directness he'd used with Henry and Sarah, showing the before state of the cabin and the current progress, talking about what he'd learned and what he still needed to figure out. Tyler edited it with a light touch, adding music only where silence would have been awkward, letting Marcus's voice carry the story. They uploaded it on a Friday afternoon. By Monday morning, it had 8,000 views. Episode 2 was Meeting My Mentor, and featured an interview with Henry Morrison, who was skeptical about being on camera, but agreed because Sarah told him it was the right thing to do. Henry demonstrated a timber framing joint, his hands moving with the kind of unconscious precision that comes from 50 years of practice, and viewers flooded the comments section with questions about where they could learn from someone like Henry, whether he taught classes, whether there were books that covered traditional joinery techniques. Episode 3 was My Biggest Mistake, and it showed the aftermath of the collapsed flooring, Marcus filming himself sitting on the ground with his leg bruised and his pride wounded, explaining exactly what he'd done wrong and how he should have done it right. The honesty of it, the willingness to show failure without trying to make it funny or dramatic, resonated with people who were tired of content that only showed success. Within 6 months, River's Edge had 112,000 subscribers. Within a year, it had 400,000. The money, small at first, then growing, went entirely back into the property. A proper well pump instead of the hand pump. Real insulation instead of the patchwork of salvaged materials. A kitchen renovation that Marcus documented in 4 episodes that collectively pulled in 8 million views. A bathroom addition that Henry helped design from a hand-drawn plan on a yellow legal pad. The financial reality of that first year was this: Marcus had spent $9,245 total. The auction and back taxes took $285. Lumber and materials, even with Jack's discounts and salvaged finds, took $3,200. The generator, well pump parts, used windows, wood stove installation, kitchen, sink and fixtures, plumbing supplies, electrical wire hand tools, gas, food, phone service, and miscellaneous necessities ate up the rest. He'd lived on $6 a day for food and slept in his truck for 9 months and worked himself to exhaustion because there was no other option. But his income for that same year, once YouTube started generating revenue in month 4, totaled $25,250. $9,000 from his part-time wages at the hardware store. $14,850 from YouTube ad revenue that started at $180 in month 4 and climbed to $3,200 by month 12. Another $1,400 in estimated value from viewer donations, people who sent tools and materials to the address Tyler had set up as a P.O. box because the mountain had no mail delivery. He ended the year with $16,000 saved, living proof that it was possible to build something from almost nothing if you were willing to accept almost nothing as a lifestyle in the meantime. And something else happened that Marcus hadn't expected. The community that formed around River's Edge was different from other YouTube comment sections. It was supportive without being saccharine, helpful without being condescending. Experienced builders offered advice. People shared their own struggles. A 62-year-old man from Wisconsin sent a box of hand tools with a note that read, "Retiring from construction. These served me 30 years. Your turn." A woman in Arizona sent her father's circular saw after he passed away. "He'd want you to have it." Marcus sat on the porch reading those notes, and something broke open in his chest that he hadn't known was sealed. He cried not because he needed the tools, though he did, but because he realized he wasn't alone in this. There were thousands of people watching who understood what it meant to build something real, who valued the work for its own sake, who saw in his struggle some reflection of their own. On December 31st, Marcus sat on the porch of his cabin with a wood stove burning inside and electricity humming and water running from a tap, and he thought about where he'd been 12 months earlier. Garbage bags, $43 a parking lot, the worst day of his life that he'd somehow turned into the foundation for the best year. Tyler came up for New Year's Eve with food from Lisa and a bottle of something celebratory. Henry and Sarah dropped by with pie. They stood together on that porch watching the stars come out over the ridge, and nobody needed to say what they were all thinking, that something important had happened here, that a kid who was supposed to fail had instead built something that mattered. But Marcus knew, even as he celebrated, that this was just the beginning. The channel was growing faster now. The money was starting to flow. And somewhere out there, people were watching with intentions that had nothing to do with inspiration and everything to do with opportunity. He didn't know it yet, but someone had already started making plans for his 47 acres, and those plans didn't include a 19-year-old kid with a dream and a $5 cabin. The collision was coming. It was only a matter of time. Year 2 began with numbers that felt unreal. January brought the subscriber count from 112,000 to 187,000. February pushed it to 285,000. By March, River's Edge had crossed 410,000 subscribers, and the revenue numbers climbing alongside made Marcus's head spin. $3,500 in January, $5,800 in February, $8,200 by the end of March. He reinvested every dollar. The second cabin project had been living in his mind for months, sketched on napkins, and debated in late-night conversations with Tyler. The concept was simple: build a guest cabin on the property, rent it short-term, use the income to fund expansion, while testing whether people would actually pay to experience what he'd built. But simple in concept didn't mean simple in execution. Marcus spent the first week of the new year clearing a site on the south-facing slope, 200 yards from the main cabin, where the morning light came in clean and strong. Henry showed up on the third day with a yellow legal pad covered in pencil sketches. Traditional timber frame design with mortise and tenon joinery. No shortcuts, the kind of structure that would stand for a century if built right. The words came out matter-of-fact, carrying the weight of someone who'd seen too many people rush good work. If you're gonna do it right. Tyler documented everything. The new series launched as Building Guest Cabin from Scratch, and the first episode, Site Selection and Foundation, pulled 400,000 views in its first week. Episode 2, Timber Selection Walking the Woods, showed Marcus and Henry hiking the property to mark trees for harvest. Henry explaining how to read bark and branch patterns to predict grain structure inside. The comments section filled with people saying this was better than anything on television, that they'd been waiting their whole lives to learn these things. The episodes kept coming. Hand-hewing logs with Henry, cutting joinery by hand because power tools made it too easy to hide mistakes, raising the frame with a crew of 5 volunteers who'd driven from 3 different states just to be part of something real for a weekend. Each video pulled between 400,000 and 800,000 views, and the channel's growth became exponential rather than linear. In April of year 2, an email arrived that Marcus almost deleted. The sender was Jake Rivera, a carpentry student from Colorado who'd been following the channel since episode 3. His request was straightforward: could he come help for a week in exchange for learning? He'd bring his own tent. His own food wouldn't be any trouble. Just wanted to put his hands on real timber under real instruction. Marcus sat with the email for 2 days. The liability concerns were real. The social geometry of having a stranger on the property was complicated, especially when that property was still as much sanctuary as construction site. But Tyler pushed him toward yes. Your story inspired him. This is how it works. Henry helped you, Jack helped you, now you help someone else. Jake showed up on a Tuesday morning in a beat-up Subaru with Montana plates, and within an hour Marcus knew Tyler had been right. The kid was 21, quiet and observant, asked good questions, and remembered the answers. He slept in a tent by the creek and worked from dawn until his hands gave out, and Henry showed up on the third day to find Jake cutting mortises with careful precision. Henry watched for a full minute before his assessment came out simple. Kid's got hands that listen. On Jake's last morning, he tried to leave $200 on the kitchen counter for materials. Marcus pushed it back. Jake pushed it forward with more force. "I can't take this and give nothing. Let me at least cover what I used." Marcus let him win that one because he recognized the gesture understood that Jake needed to give something to keep his dignity intact, the same way Marcus had needed Jack Patterson's sideways generosity to feel earned rather than given. After Jake left, Marcus couldn't stop thinking about the week. Not just the extra hands on the project, but the look on Jake's face when Henry showed him how to cut a mortise perfectly square, the way his whole posture changed when the joint slid together tight and true. There was something here bigger than building cabins. There was a model forming, though Marcus couldn't quite articulate it yet. He posted a question on the community tab, thinking about weekend workshops, timber framing traditional skills. Would anyone be interested? 400 emails arrived in 48 hours. People offering to drive 8 hours, 10 hours, willing to pay $500 just to spend a weekend learning from Henry Morrison. The waiting list started forming before Marcus had even decided to make the program real. In May, Marcus uploaded a video that would become the second most watched content he'd ever create. He called it "The Real Reason I'm Building This." And it was 18 minutes of him sitting on the porch of the main cabin speaking directly to the camera with the kind of honesty that made people stop scrolling and actually listen. He talked about what this wasn't. It wasn't about escaping society or rejecting modern life or proving some point about self-sufficiency as ideology. It was about learning to build something real with your own hands, because that work changes you in ways that watching or consuming or even studying never can. He showed the financial breakdown from year one. Every dollar accounted for the mistakes and the successes and the sheer grinding difficulty of living on $6 a day while trying to learn skills that took other people decades to master. The core message landed like a hammer. You don't need a lot of money. You need refusal to quit. You need people willing to teach you. You need the humility to fail in front of those people and keep going anyway. Everything else is just details. The video hit 3.2 million views in its first week. The Washington Post picked it up. A local television station drove up the mountain for an interview. National media started calling. And somewhere in Charlotte, a development executive named Richard Sterling added River's Edge to his research file and started making phone calls about property records in Henderson County. The guest cabin took 14 months from first shovel to final shingle. Marcus documented every step across 43 episodes, and the combined view count for the series eventually topped 18 million. Tyler's cinematography improved with each upload, learning to capture not just the work, but the relationship between Marcus and Henry, the way Sarah would show up with lunch on Saturdays, the moments when a difficult joint finally came together. Right. By late summer of year two, the cabin shell was weather-tight. By fall, the interior framing was complete. Emma Collins sent her email in early October, and Marcus read it 3 times before showing it to Tyler. She was 22, from Nashville, working an insurance desk job that paid adequately and drained her completely. She'd found River's Edge during what she described with careful understatement as a particularly miserable stretch, broken engagement, directionless career, the sense that she'd been following a plan that had never actually been hers. She'd watched the channel obsessively for 3 weeks, starting from episode 1, and something about the honesty of it had cracked something open in her. Her request was simple. Could she come work on the property for a week or 2 in exchange for learning building skills? She had 0 experience but wasn't afraid of hard work. She understood completely if the answer was no. Marcus had received dozens of similar emails. He'd declined them all for good reasons: liability, privacy, the complicated dynamics of having strangers in a space that was still more personal than professional. But Emma's email was different in a way he couldn't quite name. There was no romanticization, no talk about dreams or destiny or finding herself. Just plain words. I want to learn something real because I've been learning nothing real for too long. Tyler's response was immediate when Marcus showed him. You helped me. Jake helped you. Henry helped you. This is the model you're building whether you realize it or not. Lisa Chen, when Marcus called to ask her opinion, didn't hesitate. If she's genuine, you'll know in the first hour, and if she's not, you'll know that too. Marcus sent the reply that night, yes, you can come for 2 weeks. No payment but long hours and hard work. Bring work boots, gloves, and willingness to fail. Emma responded within 10 minutes. When can I start? She arrived the following April in year 3, driving a 10-year-old Honda Civic with Tennessee plates. Marcus knew within 3 hours that this was going to change everything. She showed up wearing steel-toed work boots that looked brand new, but were already scuffed, carrying a duffel bag and a manual on timber joinery she'd checked out from the Knoxville library. She was slender and dark-haired, with an observant quality to her face, the look of someone who processes things inwardly before speaking. What struck Marcus first was that she didn't ask what to do. She stood at the edge of the work site for maybe 5 minutes, watching, taking in the layout and the tools and the project in progress. Then she identified 2 things that needed doing, picked up the appropriate tools without asking permission, and started doing them. Henry showed up the next morning and found her replacing rotted cladding on the woodshed. Her cuts were clean and careful, measured twice and executed once, the kind of precision that can't be taught but has to be inherent. Henry watched for a full minute before turning to Marcus with a voice that didn't bother lowering. "Where'd you find her?" Marcus's response came out simple. "She found me." The 2 weeks passed in a rhythm that felt natural from the start. Emma worked dawn to dusk without complaint. She asked good questions and remembered the answers. She didn't try to prove anything or perform competence she didn't have, just showed up every morning ready to learn and willing to fail. She slept in a tent by the creek and shared meals at the main cabin. Easy conversation and comfortable silences, the kind of dynamic that develops when people are too tired from good work to maintain any kind of performance. On the last day, Marcus found himself disappointed that she was leaving, though he didn't examine that feeling too closely. She packed her duffel and loaded the Honda and stood on the porch for a long moment, looking out at the ridge like she was trying to memorize it. Her voice came out quiet, but certain. "Thank you for this. It meant more than you probably know." Marcus nodded, searching for words that didn't feel inadequate. "You did good work. Henry doesn't approve of people easily." She smiled at that, and then she was gone, driving down the mountain road while Marcus stood watching until the dust settled. She called 2 weeks later in early May of that same year. Her voice on the phone carried a different quality, more resolved than before. "I gave notice at the insurance company. I packed what I actually need instead of everything I own. Can I come back?" Marcus's response came faster than the first time, no hesitation. "Yes." Tyler, when he found out, grinned with the satisfaction of someone who'd seen this coming from a mile away. "She's special. Don't screw it up." Marcus felt his face heat. "I know." Emma returned in mid-May, and this time there was no end date. She worked alongside Marcus on the guest cabin interior, and within a week her design eye became apparent. She suggested layout changes that improved the flow of the space. She chose a color palette of warm neutrals and natural materials that made the small cabin feel larger and more inviting. Tyler filmed her explaining her choices, and the comments section filled with people asking if she had design training, if she took clients, if she'd consider consulting on their projects. The cabin was completed in early March of year 3, 14 months after breaking ground. The final episode of the series, Guest Cabin Complete Tour, showed every detail: whitewashed pine walls, dark walnut trim, live edge oak counters, matte black fixtures, windows positioned to maximize southern light. Emma had designed the interior with a spare warmth that photographed beautifully, and design publications started reaching out for interviews. Marcus and Tyler decided to list it as a short-term rental priced modestly at $120 per night when they could have charged double. The reasoning was simple. Marcus wanted the people who needed it most to be able to afford it, wanted the community from the channel to have a chance to experience the property in person rather than just through screens. The listing went live on a Friday afternoon. By Sunday evening, the next 4 months were fully booked. The reviews started coming in within days, and they carried the quality of people saying true things rather than composed things. Most peaceful place I've ever stayed. Drove 6 hours and would drive 12 next time. One review stopped Marcus cold. This is what the internet was supposed to be for finding real things. He read them all sitting on the porch of the main cabin with Emma beside him scrolling through her phone, and the emotional weight of it hit him in waves. Strangers were telling him that something he'd built with his hands and his stubbornness and Henry's patient instruction had given them what they couldn't find anywhere else. The revenue from the guest cabin added another $3,600 per month to the budget. Combined with YouTube income that now ranged between $15,000 and $25,000 per month, depending on upload schedule and view counts, Marcus was suddenly managing more money than he'd ever imagined. Every dollar went back into expansion materials for a third cabin site equipment for the workshop facility, savings for the education program he was increasingly convinced needed to exist. The collision he'd sensed coming arrived on a Tuesday morning in October of year 2, exactly 2 years after Victor Brennan had changed the locks on Oakmont Drive. Marcus was on the roof of the guest cabin doing final maintenance when his phone rang with a number he didn't recognize. He almost didn't answer, was in the middle of laying sealant, and the morning light was at the right angle, but something made him pause and swipe to accept. The voice on the other end was smooth and professional, calibrated to convey both friendliness and authority. Marcus Rivers. My name is Richard Sterling. I'm a representative of Blue Ridge Hospitality Development Group. We've become aware of your property through your channel, which is quite impressive, by the way. Marcus sat on the roof peak, the valley spreading out around him in every direction, and waited for the pitch he knew was coming. Richard continued without waiting for acknowledgement. We're interested in purchasing your property. We're prepared to offer $1.2 million for the 47 acres. The number hung in the air between them like smoke. Marcus watched a hawk circle over the western ridge and chose his words carefully. Can you send me something in writing? Richard's voice carried a note of practiced patience. Of course, but I wanted to reach out personally first. You've done remarkable work here, Marcus. We'd love to develop the area, respectfully honor what you've built. Marcus ended the call and sat on that roof for another 10 minutes, thinking through implications and consequences. He climbed down and drove straight to Tyler's house, then called Henry from Lisa's kitchen while she made coffee. Nobody was drinking. Henry's response was characteristically direct. What do you think? Marcus found himself articulating what he already knew. Feels wrong, but $1.2 million. Lisa's voice cut through without hesitation. Don't you dare sell it. He'd already known that was the answer. Sometimes you just need to hear someone else say the truth you're afraid to claim. He called Richard Sterling back the next day. The words came out firm and clear. I appreciate the offer, but this property isn't for sale. Richard's tone shifted, subtle but unmistakable, from professional warmth to something with an edge. I understand, but I hope you'll reconsider. Development is coming to this area regardless. Better to be part of it than... A meaningful pause. In the way of it, Marcus felt his jaw tighten. I'll take my chances. 3 days later, Richard called again. This time he skipped the pleasantries and went straight to explaining the larger picture. Blue Ridge Hospitality Development Group was planning a 300-acre parcel, a connected stretch of mountain land for a high-end eco-resort. Marcus's 47 acres was the keystone. Without it, they had no viable access to the higher elevation sections they wanted. His property was, in Richard's carefully chosen words, problematic for our timeline. The implication was clear even before Richard made it explicit. There are county road regulations that might affect your access easement. Questions about the original tax auction, the legality of the transfer given the irregular circumstances. Environmental permits for your well could be reviewed. None of it was explicit enough to be actionable. All of it was clear enough to be understood. Marcus's response came out ice cold. "That's not my problem." Richard's voice hardened. "I'm trying to help you, Marcus. Think about it." Marcus spent 3 days in the county records office copying everything he could find about Parcel 44A. Historical documents, surveys, deeds, tax records going back to 1947. He read until his eyes burned, taking notes on things that felt important even when he couldn't articulate why. On the 4th day, he called David Kim, a young property attorney in Asheville, who'd sent an email months earlier offering legal advice at a reduced rate. David's words had stuck with Marcus. "I think what you're building out there matters." David took the case seriously, requested all the documents Marcus had gathered, and disappeared into research for 2 weeks. When he called back, his voice carried the excitement of someone who'd found exactly what he'd been hoping to find. "Marcus, I need you to sit down for this." The discovery was buried in a 1947 county survey document. The 47 acres was described as containing mineral rights, timber rights, and a documented spring-fed water source of significant flow. Marcus had known about the spring, had built a collection basin around it, used it for water. What he hadn't known was what David explained next. David's voice gained momentum as he walked through it. "I commissioned a hydrological report. Cost $800, but it's worth every penny. That spring you're using, it feeds a water table that serves a significant portion of the surrounding watershed. This property isn't just land, Marcus. It's critical infrastructure for the mountain ecosystem." The implications clicked into place like tumblers in a lock. Marcus felt his pulse quicken. "Which means what legally?" David's answer came swift and certain. "Which means Richard Sterling can't touch this without triggering a state environmental review. And if I had to guess, that review would not go the way Blue Ridge Hospitality wants it to go." Marcus sat with that information for a day, turning it over, considering angles and consequences. Then he called Tyler. "I need to make a video, something different from what we usually do." They filmed it over a weekend, Marcus and Tyler planning the structure carefully. The tone would be educational, not accusatory. Factual, not emotional. David Kim agreed to appear on camera to lend legal credibility. They gathered documents, maps, hydrological data, and visual aids that would make complex information accessible. "The Real Reason They Want My Land" went live on a Saturday morning. Marcus opened by stating the facts plainly. He'd been offered $1.2 million for his property. He'd declined, and then he'd been threatened. He showed Richard's emails with the veiled threats highlighted in yellow. He explained the hydrological report in simple terms, showed footage of the spring and the collection basin, overlaid maps to visualize the watershed. The key moment came 14 minutes in, Marcus looking directly at the camera with the mountain spreading out behind him. "Sometimes the thing you build to survive becomes the thing that protects everyone around you. I didn't plan that, but I'll take it." The video hit 1 million views in 24 hours, 3 million by the end of the week, 5 million by month's end, becoming the most watched content River's Edge had ever produced. The response came from directions Marcus hadn't anticipated. The Appalachian Conservation Alliance reached out offering support. The Sierra Club Regional Chapter sent lawyers willing to work pro bono. The Blue Ridge Watershed Association issued a public statement calling for permanent protection of the property. A state legislator announced an investigation into development pressure tactics on small landowners. Cora Deacon, a sharp-eyed reporter from the Charlotte Observer, published a front-page feature that revealed a pattern. Other property owners came forward with similar stories about Blue Ridge Hospitality Development Group. The pressure, the veiled threats, the implication that resistance was futile. Richard Sterling's phone calls stopped. A week later, an email arrived with corporate letterhead. Blue Ridge Hospitality Development Group was withdrawing interest in Ridgeview Mountain area projects. No apology, no explanation, just withdrawal. David Kim called with barely contained satisfaction. "You won." Marcus stood on the porch watching the sunset and felt weight lifting from shoulders he didn't know were tense. Not triumph exactly, but the settled stillness that comes when a threat passes and you can finally exhale. He was 20 years old. The property was his, protected now by environmental designation and public attention. River's Edge had 640,000 subscribers and climbing. The income had stabilized at $12,000 to $18,000 per month. The business account held $82,000 in savings. The main cabin stood restored, the guest cabin was generating revenue, and a second guest cabin was already 60% framed. The vision that had been forming in fragments finally crystallized into something Marcus could articulate. This property could become more than his home and more than content for a channel. It could be a learning center where digital community transformed into physical relationship, where people could come and put their hands on wood and stone and rope and learn the fundamentals of making things that last. Emma understood before he finished explaining it. She'd been there for the Jake Rivera visit, had seen the transformation that happened when someone learned a real skill from a patient teacher. Her design background gave her a practical framework for thinking about logistics, how many students per session, what facilities would be needed, how to structure curriculum, what partnerships might make it sustainable. By November, Marcus and Emma were working side by side 12 hours a day, their relationship building the way the structures on the property built slowly with intention, with the understanding that anything worth having needed a proper foundation before you started raising walls. They spent long days doing difficult physical labor, and in that particular intimacy of shared work where there's no performance because you're too tired for performance. A person reveals themselves through how they handle frustration, how they respond to failure, whether they keep their word when keeping it is hard. Tyler noticed before either of them acknowledged it out loud. He'd catch them in frame together and see the way Marcus's posture changed when Emma was nearby, the way Emma's whole face softened when Marcus explained something he was proud of. Henry noticed too, mentioned it to Sarah over dinner with the satisfied air of someone who'd predicted this outcome from the beginning. But Marcus and Emma didn't name what was happening between them, not yet. They simply kept working, kept building, kept learning to know each other with the kind of quiet certainty that doesn't need to be spoken aloud to be absolutely real. The second guest cabin reached completion in late November of year 3. Emma had led the interior design with more confidence this time, and the result was even more refined than the first, same warm aesthetic but evolved more cohesive, photographed beautifully for the listing. They priced it identically at $120 per night, and it booked solid within 48 hours of going live. Winter came to the mountain, and Marcus spent the short days clearing ground for the workshop facility that would anchor the education program. Henry consulted on the design, traditional timber frame construction, large enough to hold 12 students comfortably with proper ventilation and tool storage and safety equipment. Partnership paperwork was in progress with the Appalachian Craft Preservation Society, which would provide accreditation and historical designation. On a December evening when the first real snow fell, Marcus and Emma sat on the porch of the main cabin watching it accumulate on the ridge. Tyler had gone home. Henry and Sarah had left hours ago. The property was quiet except for the soft hiss of snow and the occasional crack of settling wood from the stove inside. Emma's voice came out soft, almost hesitant. "I'm not just here for the building, you know." Marcus turned to look at her, snow catching in her dark hair. "I know." She smiled, reaching for his hand. "Good." They sat like that until the cold drove them inside, not saying anything else because nothing else needed to be said. The anticipation itself was a kind of sweetness. Neither of them was ready to give up yet that space between knowing and naming where possibility lives. The channel crossed 900,000 subscribers in early December. The property now held 3 structures with a 4th in planning. The bank account had grown to $150,000, all of it earmarked for expansion and education programming. Marcus was living on $3,500 a month and banking the rest, still eating simply and living humbly, because the values that had sustained him through the hardest year hadn't changed just because the numbers had. And somewhere in Ashford, Virginia, Elena Rivers sat in her rental apartment watching her son's videos and working up the courage to make a phone call she'd been avoiding for 2 years, knowing that some bridges burn completely and others just char around the edges, hoping she could find out which kind this was before it was too late. 2 years later, the call came on a February evening when snow lay heavy on the ridge and the wood stove filled the main cabin with heat that made the windows fog. Marcus was reviewing workshop facility blueprints while Emma cooked dinner, the domestic rhythm so natural now that neither of them remarked on it anymore. His phone lit up with Lisa Chen's name. Her voice carried a weight he recognized immediately. "Marcus, your mother called me." The silence stretched long enough that Lisa felt compelled to ask if he was still there. Marcus set down his pencil, watching Emma glance over from the stove with concern creasing her forehead. "What did she want?" Lisa's exhale came through the line like surrender. "She wants to see you." A pause, then the rest of it. "Victor left her about 8 months ago. I didn't tell you because I didn't know if it was my place. She's living in a rental apartment on the other side of town. She's been watching your channel." Marcus thanked Lisa and ended the call, then sat very still with the information settling in him like sediment in water. Emma turned off the burner and came to sit beside him, not asking questions, just present in the way that had become one of the things he valued most about her. She put her hand over his and waited. He didn't call Elena that night. Didn't call her the next day either. The information sat inside him, strangely ripples spreading to places he couldn't predict. For 4 days he carried it around like a stone in his pocket, turning it over during work, thinking about it while falling asleep, examining it from different angles to see if the shape changed. Emma handled those 4 days with the practical grace that defined her, not prying but making sure he ate, leaving books on the table that weren't about anything in particular, creating space for him to process without pressure. Tyler noticed Marcus was distracted and didn't push. Henry showed up for their regular Saturday work session and mentioned in passing that forgiveness was for the forgiver more than the forgiven. Take your time figuring out if you're ready. On the 5th day, Marcus made the call. Elena's voice when she answered sounded different than he remembered, smaller somehow but also more solid, like something compressed under pressure until it became denser than before. Her name for him came out wrong first, then corrected, "Caleb." "Marcus. Sorry, Marcus." Then without preamble or justification, the words he'd never thought he'd hear, "I'm sorry, Marcus, I'm sorry every single day." He wasn't ready to say it was okay. The wound had healed, but the scar tissue was still tender, and pretending otherwise would have dishonored what he'd been through. His response came measured, "I heard you." They talked for 40 minutes. Elena shared pieces of the years he'd missed, how Victor's resentment had grown, how he'd blamed her for coddling Marcus in memory, how he'd eventually left for another woman who didn't come with the complication of a son who'd made something of himself. She'd lost her job at the dental office, downsized to a 1-bedroom apartment, started watching River's Edge around month 5. Her voice broke on certain words. "I see what I could have had, what I lost." Marcus listened and tried to separate the mother he'd needed at 18 from the woman on the phone who sounded genuinely shattered by her own choices. They weren't the same person, and maybe that was the point. People changed or they didn't, and you had to decide whether you had the energy to find out which had happened. At the end of the call, something in him shifted enough to extend an opening. "You can come visit the property if you want. See what I built." Elena's response came out choked. "I'd like that. Thank you." She arrived on a Saturday in March, driving a 10-year-old Civic that had clearly seen better days. The access road was graded and graveled now, no longer the rutted nightmare of that first afternoon, and she parked in the clearing Marcus had designated for visitors. She got out and stood looking at the main cabin, one hand coming up to cover her mouth, not speaking. Marcus waited on the porch, giving her time to absorb it. Emma was inside finishing breakfast cleanup but visible through the window. Tyler had offered to come film, but Marcus had declined this one, some moments too private for content. Elena's voice came out barely audible. "You built all of this." Marcus came down the steps, keeping distance, but not cold distance. "Most of it. Henry helped, Tyler helped, Emma helped." He paused, making sure she understood. "A lot of people helped." She nodded, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand in a gesture so familiar it hit somewhere unguarded in Marcus's chest. Her words carried the weight of genuine understanding. "That's how it works, isn't it? You can't build something real completely alone." He showed her the property. The main cabin first, then the 2 guest cabins with their clean lines and Emma's warm design aesthetic. The spring with its stone collection basin that had become the fulcrum of the environmental protection. The workshop facility still under construction, timber frame rising against the sky. She touched the logs with something like reverence, ran her fingers over joinery that Henry had taught Marcus to cut by hand. At one point she stopped and looked at him directly. "Your father, Thomas, he would be so proud." The name landed strangely. A person Marcus barely remembered resurrected in a sentence. He didn't know what to do with that information, so he just nodded and kept walking. They ended up at the kitchen table Marcus had built himself, timber frame with mortise and tenon joinery, the first piece of furniture he'd made from scratch. Emma poured coffee and joined them, Tyler stopping by briefly to say hello before giving them space. The conversation wasn't easy, but it was honest. Elena asking questions about the build process and the channel and what came next, Marcus answering with the same directness he used on camera. Elena turned to Emma at one point, her voice sincere. "Take care of him." Emma's response came without hesitation. "We take care of each other." Elena smiled at that sad but genuine, and Marcus saw her recognize that his life had moved forward into something complete without her. The visit lasted 3 hours. When she left, something had shifted. Not forgiveness, not yet, because forgiveness wasn't a single moment, but a long process that Marcus was only beginning. But it was a start, a foundation settling into ground. The following week, Emma found a message in the River's Edge inbox while sorting through the daily flood of emails and sponsor inquiries. She brought it to Marcus without comment, letting him decide what to do with it. The sender was Victor Brennan, and the message contained exactly 3 sentences. "I made a mistake. I've been watching your channel. I thought you should know I'm proud." Marcus read it twice, then set his phone down and walked outside. He stood on the porch of the cabin he'd bought for $5 and rebuilt from ruin, the mountains spreading out in every direction. And the feeling that washed over him wasn't what he'd imagined. Not the satisfaction of being proven right, not the vindication of showing someone who'd doubted him. Just a sense of weight-lifting tension releasing from muscles he hadn't known were holding it. He didn't respond to Victor's message. Not then. Maybe not ever. Emma found him there 20 minutes later and read the situation correctly. "You don't owe him anything." His answer came simple. "I know, that's why it doesn't bother me." By the time Marcus turned 23, River's Edge had 1.85 million subscribers and had been featured in This Old House magazine, The Washington Post, and a PBS documentary that aired regionally before getting picked up by a national outdoor network. The property contained 4 structures: the original restored cabin, 2 completed guest cabins generating steady rental income, and a working timber frame workshop that was 80% complete. The financial picture had stabilized into something sustainable. YouTube revenue ranged between $28,000 and $42,000 per month, depending on upload schedule and algorithm favor. The 2 guest cabins brought in $7,200 per month combined when fully booked, which they consistently were. Workshop deposits and advance bookings were starting to flow, projected to add another $45,000 annually once programming launched in earnest. Marcus paid himself a modest salary of $3,500 per month and banked the rest. Tyler drew $4,500 as full-time videographer and had hired a part-time editor to handle the increasing workload. Emma took $3,000 for design and operations management. The remainder went to materials expansion, insurance, and savings. Living simply had become habitual rather than necessary, but Marcus saw no reason to change what worked. The media attention brought opportunities he'd never imagined. A publisher offered a $180,000 advance for a book about the journey. Marcus considered it for a week before declining with careful words, "Not yet. The story's still being written. Ask me again in 5 years when I understand what it means." Speaking invitations came from universities and craft conferences and high school career days. Marcus accepted the high schools and declined most of the rest, more comfortable with teenagers trying to figure out their path than with adults who wanted to extract lessons and frameworks from something that had mostly been instinct and stubbornness and luck. The partnership with the Appalachian Craft Preservation Society formalized in April. The property received official historic designation, which brought tax benefits and another layer of protection against future development pressure. The workshop became an accredited learning site authorized to issue certificates in traditional construction techniques that would carry weight with employers and preservation organizations. The first weekend, Timber Framing Intensive, was scheduled for late April, with 12 students paying $450 each price, including lodging in the guest cabins and meals that Emma and Sarah Morrison had agreed to coordinate. The student roster read like a cross-section of America seeking something real. A 32-year-old carpenter from Ohio, wanting to learn traditional methods. A 64-year-old retiree from Florida, who'd always wanted to do this. A 19-year-old college dropout from Pennsylvania, considering a career change. A 42-year-old architect from North Carolina who needed to understand materials hands-on. Henry would lead instruction with Marcus assisting. Tyler would film for a documentary series. Emma would handle logistics. The waiting list had grown to over 400 names for the next 12 months, people willing to wait a year just for a chance to spend a weekend learning from Henry Morrison. The workshop launched on a Friday afternoon in late April with 12 strangers pulling into the clearing and climbing out of their vehicles with the particular mixture of excitement and nervousness that comes with doing something you've been building up in your mind for months. Henry greeted them with his characteristic economy of language, laying out expectations and safety protocols, making it clear that this would be work, not performance learning, not entertainment. By Saturday afternoon, something remarkable had happened. The 12 strangers had become a team moving around the workspace with growing confidence, asking questions that got more sophisticated as the hours passed. Henry taught a mortise and tenon joint that afternoon, demonstrating the cuts with his hands moving in patterns worn smooth by 50 years of practice, then turning the students loose to attempt it themselves. Marcus watched a woman in her 50s cut her first joint, saw the shift in her shoulders when the pieces slid together. He watched the 19-year-old struggle for 2 hours before finally getting it right, saw Henry spend 10 minutes examining the kid's work from every angle before stepping back with something that might have been a smile. On Sunday evening, as the students packed their tools and prepared to leave, the energy in the workshop had transformed. These weren't the same people who'd arrived Friday afternoon. Something had shifted in them, some reconnection to capability and physical competence that most of them had been missing for years. One student, the carpenter from Ohio, found Marcus before leaving. "This changed something in me. I don't know how to explain it, but I'm not the same person I was Friday afternoon." Marcus understood exactly what he meant, because he'd felt it himself 3 years earlier, standing in front of a ruined cabin and deciding it was the beginning of something rather than the end. He shook the man's hand and watched him drive away, then stood in the clearing with Emma and Tyler and Henry and Sarah, all of them understanding that they'd just witnessed the model working proof that what they were building mattered beyond content and revenue. Tyler uploaded the workshop documentary series over the following month, 6 episodes chronicling the weekend from arrival through departure, and the comment section became a testament to hunger for this kind of experience. The subsequent workshops booked out for 18 months within a week of the series' conclusion. Marcus and Emma set a wedding date for June's small ceremony on the property with 40 guests. Henry agreed to officiate after getting ordained online specifically for the purpose, and Sarah took charge of the cake. Lisa Chen insisted on catering and refused any discussion of payment. Jack Patterson donated all the hardware for an arbor Marcus was building, continuing his years-long practice of sideways generosity that preserved everyone's dignity. Emma designed everything with her characteristic attention to natural aesthetic ceremony on the porch of the main cabin reception in the meadow where the workshop now stood, decorations limited to what grew wild on the property. They agreed that Tyler would film, but keep the ceremony private, only posting reception footage to the channel afterward. Some things were for them, some things were for the community, and knowing the difference mattered. In May, Marcus started sketching plans for an apprenticeship program, 2 or 3 young people per year living on the property for 6 months and learning traditional building skills through intensive hands-on work. Emma suggested women-only workshops, recognizing that many women felt intimidated in mixed-gender spaces but thrived when learning among peers. Henry proposed a partnership with local high schools to bring students out for field trips and exposure to craft work as viable career path. The vision kept expanding, limited only by how fast they could build infrastructure and how carefully they protected the integrity of what made it work. Marcus had learned from the Richard Sterling encounter that growth without boundaries could destroy the thing you were trying to preserve. Better to move deliberately and maintain quality than scale recklessly and lose authenticity. In early June, Marcus uploaded a video that drew more attention than anything except the Richard Sterling confrontation. He called it 5 years from $5, and it was a 22-minute reflection on everything that had happened since that October afternoon at the tax auction. He showed the before state of the property through Tyler's early footage, walked through the current state, talked about the people who'd made it possible, and the philosophy that had sustained it. The core message built toward a conclusion he'd been circling for months. You don't need permission to start. You don't need perfect circumstances or ideal preparation or approval from people who've already decided you'll fail. You need the thing you're building to matter to you more than their doubt matters. You need willingness to look stupid while you learn. You need the humility to accept help when it's offered, and the integrity to offer help when you've learned enough to give it. Everything else is just noise. The video crossed 4 million views in its first week. The comments overflowed with people sharing their own stories of starting from nothing, of being told they couldn't, of building something meaningful against the expectations of everyone around them. A high school teacher in Oregon showed it to her senior class, and half of them emailed Marcus afterward. A retired engineer in Maine sent a letter saying he'd spent 40 years in a career he tolerated and was now at 68 finally building the woodshop he'd been dreaming about since he was 20. The wedding happened on a Saturday in mid-June under the arbor Marcus had built from timber he'd milled himself. Henry performed the ceremony with Sarah beside him, both of them dressed in what Marcus suspected was the same outfit they'd worn to their own wedding 40-some years earlier. The vows were simple and honest. No performance, just 2 people who'd learned to know each other through shared work, making a public commitment to keep choosing each other. Tyler filmed the reception but kept the camera off during the ceremony itself, honoring the boundary between public and private that Marcus and Emma had been careful to maintain. Lisa Chen's eyes shone throughout. Henry's voice caught when he pronounced them married. Sarah's cake was perfect. The video that went up the following week was titled "We Got Married" and showed 8 minutes of reception footage, joy and dancing and toasts that made the comment section overflow with congratulations from people who'd been following since episode 1. The community had invested in this story, and seeing it reach this milestone felt like collective victory. On a summer afternoon, when the workshop program was running its 3rd session and the property hummed with the sound of instruction and learning, Jack Patterson drove up to the property for the first time. He'd been one of the earliest supporters, had provided materials when Marcus had watched from a respectful distance as the $5 cabin became something that attracted national media attention. But he'd never actually visited, had maintained a careful separation between Marcus's work life at the hardware store and his building life on the mountain. Marcus saw the truck coming up the access road and felt his chest tighten with an emotion he couldn't quite name. He met Jack at the clearing, and they walked the property together in silence. Jack stopping occasionally to examine a joint or a beam or a piece of stonework with the evaluating eye of a man who'd sold building materials his entire life and knew good work when he encountered it. They ended on the porch with coffee, the valley spreading out below them, students' voices carrying from the workshop where Henry was teaching. Jack studied the view for a long moment before speaking. His voice came out quiet but certain. "You know what this is?" Marcus waited, knowing Jack would answer his own question. "This is what happens when somebody doesn't quit." Marcus felt the words land, turned them over, recognized the truth in them. He looked out at the ridge, at the trees, at the 47 acres that had been nobody's, until they were his, at the structures that had risen from ruin and learning and mistakes and cold mornings, and the patient instruction of people like Henry and Jack, who gave their knowledge freely to someone willing to receive it with humility. His response came simple, "Yeah, I think you're right." Jack stood to leave a few minutes later, shaking Marcus's hand with the kind of firm grip that communicated respect between people who understood the value of work done right. After he drove away, Marcus sat alone on that porch for a while. Emma inside with Sarah coordinating the evening meal. Tyler down at the workshop, filming Henry's voice carrying instructions that would change someone's understanding of what they were capable of. Marcus was 23 years old. He'd been thrown out at 18 with $43 and a truck, and the particular loneliness that comes when family chooses comfort over connection. He'd bought 47 acres and a wrecked cabin for $5 because it was all he could afford, and because something in him, even at the lowest point, recognized possibility where everyone else saw worthless. He'd built it the only way real things get built, with mistakes and failures and unexpected help from unexpected people, with long stretches of work nobody watched and quiet moments of understanding that it was enough. The cabin had become 4 structures. The structures had become a learning center. The learning center had become proof that refusal to quit and willingness to learn could transform $5 into something no amount of money could buy. There is a particular kind of justice in the world that arrives not with fanfare, but in ordinary moments, in the form of a life that became what it became, because the person living it refused to let the worst day define all the days that followed. And that story is still being written on a mountain in Virginia, one log at a time.